Good evening. I'm Cassie Pekarsky, the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Truman Library Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you all in person and online to tonight's program, the third in our annual Truman Legacy series, Women Rising. A special thanks to the Martha Jane Phillips Starfield of Interest Fund for partnering with us to create and launch Women Rising. Their generosity allows us to better profile the women who found their place on the world stage during the Truman administration, to reflect on their contributions, and to share their stories as a catalyst for promoting women as activists and leaders. The Truman presidency is 3/4 of a century behind us. His presidential library opened to researchers more than 65 years ago. One could be forgiven for assuming that the stories and achievements during Truman's years in the White House have already largely been told, but that's not so. President Truman's support of women's rights is a lesser-known area of his progressive leadership. He voiced support for the concept of the Equal Rights Amendment. He signed into law the Women Armed Services Integration Act, enabling women to serve as permanent, regular members of the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the recently formed Air Force. This not only paved the way for thousands of women's military careers, it guaranteed equal pay, something that civilian women are still fighting for. President Truman was interested in nominating a woman to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, this is 3 decades before Sandra Day O'Connor. However, he was discouraged from making the step. The sitting justices were concerned that the presence of a woman would negatively impact their deliberations. I know what I have to say about that, and I bet Bess had a mouthful too. Now, during a lecture at Columbia University in 1959, when asked what he thought of the chances of a woman becoming president, Truman, off the cuff, said, quote, "I've said for a long time that women have everything else, they might as well have the presidency," end quote. Now, I'm sure Bess had something to say about this too, but the sentiment was there. Truman installed more than 200 women in high-level positions during his presidency, a remarkable record for a president born in rural southern Missouri in 1884. Between 1945 and 1952, Truman named 18 women to positions requiring Senate confirmation. Of these, 9 were jobs that women had never held before. Here are just a few of the first. Helen Eugenie Moore Anderson was the first woman appointed to U.S. ambassador. Bernita Shelton Matthews was the first woman to serve on a U.S. district court. Ida Spurlock Sampson was the first Black woman appointed to the United Nations. Frida Barkin Hennick was the first female commissioner of the FCC. And the reason we're all gathered here this evening, Marie Rosenberg, the first woman appointed to serve as Assistant Secretary of Defense. As you can see, there are many stories to tell, and we're grateful to the Martha Jane Phillips Starfield of Interest Fund for helping us share the lesser-known stories of women's history and achievements, so they will be lesser known no more. I want to thank Christopher Gorham for being with us. Christopher is a lawyer turned historian and author of The Confidante, the untold story of the woman who helped win World War II and shape modern America. With degrees from the University of Michigan, Tufts University, and Syracuse University College of Law, he, of course, brings a wealth of knowledge to his work. His writing has been featured in numerous publications, including the Washington Post. And when he's not writing or teaching modern American history at Westford Academy, Gorham can often be found exploring the great outdoors or indulging his passion for travel, which luckily has brought him here tonight. Before I turn it over to Christopher, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the program. If you'd like to ask a question, make your way to the aisle at that point. Second, thank you again for joining us tonight, and stay tuned for more fascinating programs in 2024 as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of 1949, which gave birth to NATO and the Department of Defense and saw the end of the Berlin airlift, among many other things. And in the meantime, tickets are now on sale for the 25th annual Wild About Harry on April 18th. This year's fundraising event benefiting Truman's Presidential Library and Legacy will feature best-selling author Evan Thomas and Truman Legacy of Leadership Award honoree, the Honorable Roy Blunt. Whether you love history, love Harry, or just love a great party, you won't want to miss it. Learn more at trumanlibraryinstitute.org. And of course, if you have not already, go visit the incredible stories, theaters, and high-tech interactives inside the stunning $30 million renovation of the Truman Presidential Library Museum. Now, without further ado,
The New York Times called her one of the most influential women in the country's public affairs for a quarter of a century. Life magazine said she was far and away the most important woman in American government. Her name was Anna Rosenberg, and her story has never been told before.
I came over here from Budapest when I was 8 years old.
She made her own way in a man's world.
They were amazed, they were shocked, they were troubled, but I must say most of them were just a little bewildered.
She was invited into the circle of a couple named Franklin and Eleanor.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
And became an advisor and confidant to a president in peace and war.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
As the Cold War exploded into conflict, she was named to the highest position any woman had ever held in the American military.
Mrs. Rosenberg, wartime envoy of Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, will add...
Then, Joe McCarthy targeted her as a communist.
Where a communist is concerned, she is not a free agent.
That's a goddamn lie.
The Confidant. Coming March 2023.
Thank you. I want to thank the Truman Library, the Truman Library Institute, the board, the staff, and I want to thank Alex and Morgan and Cassie for having me and for you all for being here. Like so many families in Eastern Europe, Anna's family had reason to leave their homeland. In 1910, it was because her father, the man with the white cap, he was a successful businessman. He provided furnishings for the emperor. One day in 1910, he went to make the installation of those furnishings, and the emperor broke the contract and said, "You're not going to do this anymore for me." In an instant, Albert Lederer's was ruined financially, and he set sail for New York. It took him 2 years before he could summon for his daughters and his wife. But in those 2 years, Albert Lederer became a fiercely patriotic American, learning English, reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. When the flag fluttered above, it would bring tears to his eyes. and the idea that in this country, his adopted country, the ordinary person could have a say. This was important to him. So when he summoned for his daughters and his wife, he instilled in Anna these lessons of his adopted country. Even as a schoolgirl in the public schools of New York City, Anna Lederer was engaged in the big issues of the day. The first was, of course, women's right to vote. Even as an adolescent and a teenager, Anna marched along with tens of thousands of other women on the avenues and boulevards of New York City for the women's right to vote. And of course, when the United States entered World War I in 1917, she did all she could. She sold Liberty bonds from a booth. I did the math for the book, something in the neighborhood of $100,000. And not only that, she and her sister, as you can see here, volunteered as Red Cross nurses. In 1919, Anna married Mike Rosenberg, a veteran of World War I, and the two in 1920 had a son, Thomas. Now it was time for Anna to start her career. She met two very, very important people at this stage. One was Belle Moskowitz, who was the de facto chief of staff of the governor of New York. From Moskowitz, she learned how women could exercise power behind the scenes. From her political father, if you will, was a district leader from Tammany Hall, a man named Jim Hagan. From Jim Hagan, she learned how to, the bare-knuckled world of retail politics of New York City, how to knock on hundreds of doors and make thousands of phone calls to get your issue acted upon. Anna did not go to college, which is a similarity with President Truman, and she certainly didn't open a law book, but with her political mother and political father, she became one of the first women in American history to manage political campaigns. Not just aldermen, not just in Albany, but U.S. congressional campaigns. She was a young mother, a young businesswoman. She had a labor mediation office. She always made time for politics because that's what her father had taught her. One newspaper called her at this point the busiest woman in New York. The most important people that she met in her early life were, of course, the Roosevelts. It was 1928. Anna was 28 years old. She attended a Democratic tea hosted by Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt met her and said, "You need to meet my husband. He's running for governor of New York." Just days later, Anna Rosenberg found herself looking up at the stairway of the Roosevelt's twin townhouse in New York City, and days after that, she was on the team where he was running for governor. He shocked the Empire State by winning, and 9 months later, of course, the curtain of Great Depression fell across the state and the nation, and Roosevelt put together an energetic response to the catastrophe. This energetic response made him the leading candidate for president in 1932, and of course, he scaled up what he pioneered in New York, and he called it the New Deal. He needed New Deal officers for his New Deal army, and he had a good one in Anna Rosenberg. Franklin Roosevelt made Anna Rosenberg the only woman regional director of not one, but two massive New Deal programs, the second of which was Social Security. She would have elderly ladies say to her, "I can't tell you my real age because my husband doesn't know my real age." And she would say, "Uncle Sam and I will keep your secrets." With dozens of lawyers under her command and several field offices, she signed up 6 million New Yorkers to Social Security. She was very fond of, even as a young woman, very fond of these elaborate, fancy hats. That was her trademark. She's not wearing one in this picture, but in other pictures you'll see. In 1938, she was back in Washington for a meeting of the Social Security Board, and the president wheeled in and teased her about the hats, which he loved to do. He said, "Now, Anna, that's a very fine hat you have on today, but I can't tell if you're coming or going." And she said, "Well, Mr. President, that's because it's a New Deal hat." In 1941, the summer of 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, the president knows that war is on the horizon, and certainly the defense industries do too. They're building the tanks and the planes for our allies and for the American armed forces. The problem was these were good-paying jobs, but they were only being given to white Americans. The black leader of the day, a man named A. Philip Randolph, said to the White House, "I will march for equality, and I will bring tens of thousands of marchers with me." Even Eleanor Roosevelt was sympathetic with this, but the president was in a tremendous bind. He knew that Southern lawmakers would make no concessions to the black leadership, but he also needed their support if America were going to be in this war on the Allied side. He ordered, over 2 weeks in the summer of 1941, he ordered Anna Rosenberg to be at every meeting with the black leadership, between the black leadership and the White House, both in New York City and Washington. And at the end of the 2 weeks, she thought she had a draft executive order that would be workable to both sides. The problem was to get him to sign it. This is where Eleanor comes in. Eleanor said, now, you love those fancy hats. Go down to Georgetown boutiques, buy yourself a brand new hat, get the confidence up, and come back and get the boss to sign it. And that's what she did. She came back to the White House. She spread the executive order on his desk and said, sign it, Mr. President, sign it. And he listened. Executive Order 8802 was, according to historians, the first federal action on Reconstruction, or the first federal action on civil rights since Reconstruction. By 1942-43, Anna Rosenberg was known in the newspapers as Mrs. Fix-It. And there was a tremendous problem in Buffalo, New York. The defense industries up there built everything: tanks, planes, parachutes, belt buckles, everything for our allies and for the Americans. They were nearly 100,000 workers short. Roosevelt said, I'm going to make you the labor czar of Buffalo. Go up there and fix it. She got to work. She knew that more women were needed, not just single women, but women with children, married women. Even the grandmothers would have to put on the bandana and the coveralls and get to work. But Buffalo had done none of the logistics. They hadn't a place for, the child care wasn't taken care of, so Anna had to do that. She established child care that was adequate. She had the parks lit and heated 24/7. Movie theaters ran all day and night, and she had a safe place for these women to cash their checks at 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning when they got off their shifts. Tens of thousands of women took these jobs. They punched in and they punched back. The plan became known in the magazines and newspapers as the Buffalo Plan. Some Time magazine called it the Rosenberg Plan, but most everyone else called it the Buffalo Plan. And a big part of it was moving workers where they were surplus, like New York City, to where they were needed, like Portland, Oregon. Here's how it worked, the Buffalo Plan, initiated by Anna Rosenberg. Liberty ships, these massive 477-foot-long transport ships. The first one took 131 days to build. After the Rosenberg Plan, or the Buffalo Plan, the keel of the Robert E. Peary was laid on a Sunday. After the New Yorkers were on the docks, it set sail 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later. A woman was there to christen the ship, arrived too late. A dock worker yelled out, "Just keep standing there, ma'am. There'll be another one along in a minute." What I found remarkable, too, about the Buffalo Plan is this. This is the citation from President Truman. This dates from 1946, talking specifically about the importance of this plan to our efforts to be victorious in World War II. He said the Buffalo Plan, without it, we would not have had the necessary manpower for war production. And I just find that incredible, because I think we have a tendency to think of the arsenal of democracy like flipping a light switch. We flipped the switch, and Chrysler was building the tanks, and Ford was building the planes, and everything worked out really well. But that was not the case. There was labor piracy, there was absenteeism, there was a lack of child care for women workers, and all of this was part of the Buffalo Plan. And for President Truman to acknowledge that and to award her the Medal of Merit in 1946, I think speaks to that. In 1944, President Roosevelt made the extraordinary decision to send a civilian woman as his personal emissary to Nazi-occupied France, and that person was, of course, Anna Rosenberg. She arrived in France just weeks after D-Day, so soon after D-Day that the troops were still hemmed in the corner of France where the hedgerows were and hadn't yet broken out into flat territory. Her mission was to find out from the soldiers themselves what they hoped for, what they dreamed for when they came back to the United States after the war. She was not sent there as a VIP. She was there to find out from the men themselves what they wished for after that day of demobilization that was still far in the future. Over 6 weeks in Europe, as she crossed France with Patton's Third Army, she ate rations off the hoods of Jeeps with these guys. She listened as they pulled pictures of their sweethearts out of their helmets. And she wrote down what they said in notebook after notebook. What they said surprised her, and it would later surprise the policymakers in Washington and the president. They wanted a college education. Sure, they wanted job training when they got home. Sure, they wanted dancing lessons when they got home. But more than that, they wanted a piece of the America they were trying to help save. They wanted a college education. When she arrived back in Washington, the president called her immediately for a debrief. She said President Roosevelt's face lit up. And the provisions thereafter grafted onto the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which became the GI Bill, were not perfect, but the GI Bill elevated millions of Americans into the middle class and transformed American post-war prosperity. Some of you will recognize this person. There aren't too many people that I can think of that would refer to General George S. Patton as Georgie, but Anna Rosenberg was one of them. The general was very fond of her, but his dog was not. His dog bit her on the backside when she arrived at his forward command post. In the lead up to the 1944 presidential election, the vice president at the time was Henry Wallace, and the decision was made by the Democratic Party and by President Roosevelt to drop Wallace. He was not going to be tenable as the vice president, especially given the ill health of Franklin Roosevelt. So the people weren't comfortable with Wallace being the president in case Roosevelt died in office. That left two men vying for this position. One was Jimmy Burns up there on the left. Now, Burns had been a loyal foot soldier to Roosevelt, but he was not going to be the vice president here because he had voted against anti-lynching legislation. He was from South Carolina, and the thought was that he had some racial baggage that he was bringing to the office. So the decision was made to tell him the bad news that he would not be the vice president in 1944. The person that was to deliver the bad news on behalf of Franklin Roosevelt was Anna Rosenberg. Roosevelt, of course, told her, "You're going to tell Jimmy Burns that he's out." And she told David McCullough, the Truman historian, biographer, she told David McCullough when he interviewed her, she said, President Roosevelt, I can't do that. You have to go tell him yourself. But she knew that he wouldn't, so it was left up to her. Anna Rosenberg told Jimmy Burns, imagine having this conversation. You're not going to be the vice president. It's going to go to Senator Harry Truman, which it did. Just 2 weeks before Roosevelt died, he ordered Anna Rosenberg back to Europe to continue her work with the demobilization. Before she left Washington, Roosevelt had died, and the new president, President Truman, said, if the boss wanted you to go on this mission, I want you to go on this mission. So off she went. But when she arrived in Europe, the mission had to change completely because General Eisenhower had liberated the first concentration camps on the Western Front. Eisenhower was aghast at what he saw. He cabled Washington. He immediately sent Congress people, send journalists to bear witness to these atrocities. But Anna Rosenberg was already in Europe, so she was flown to the Nordhausen concentration camp just days after its liberation. So soon after its liberation that the prisoners were still dressed in their striped uniforms. When she went on these trips, she always wore a combination of a woman's army uniform and man's trousers and man's parachute boots. But she climbed out of her Jeep that day wearing, as she always did, a woman's purse and a man's briefcase. And she climbed out of her Jeep that day to a hellish scene. And women prisoners approached her. She said they could barely stand erect. These women prisoners approached her, and she thought, what can I possibly do? I don't have water, medicine, food. What can I give? She gave a lipstick and a compact to some women. Then she reached in the briefcase and gave a pencil and notebook to others. I found that she only spoke about this one time, but it was very profound. She talked about the insufficiency of this gesture. But she also said the look on these women's faces after something had been given back to them, after everything had been taken from them, even their very names. In October of 1945, not that long after the end of the war in the Pacific, Anna Rosenberg was honored by the president as the first American man or woman to be awarded the Medal of Freedom. This is now, of course, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It's been expanded by presidents thereafter, but this was the first ever medal honored, given to an American for helping defeat the enemy, a civilian for helping defeat the enemy in the Second World War. You can see the quote up there by the Secretary of War Patterson and the tremendous look of pride on her face. In 1946 and 47, President Truman was wrestling with a difficult decision whether to desegregate the armed forces in the federal government. And to give himself some ammunition for this decision, he put together a commission called the Compton Commission. Anna Rosenberg was on that commission. The only African American was Truman Gibson. He's up there on the top right. Sam Roseman, one of Roosevelt's speechwriters. Well, this commission put together a report that gave Truman evidence that segregated armed forces, both in terms of training and combat, would be more effective. It would be, as Anna put it later, not only morally correct, but in the national interest, in the interest of national security and national defense. Truman, with this information, did the following. Well, I'll put it this way. He had the report from the Compton Commission, and then in May of 1947, when Anna was awarded the Medal of Merit, which is that first medal that was given to her for her work during the war, he called an impromptu meeting with the members of the Compton Commission that were at the White House, including Anna Rosenberg, Truman Gibson, Sam Roseman. He'd also learned about the terrible blinding of Sergeant Woodard, Isaac Woodard, the black sergeant who was grievously wounded. And in this impromptu, very frank conversation around his desk in the Oval Office, he said, any country in which this happens has got to be in a pretty bad fix. Truman said, there's got to be something radically wrong with the system. He said, this stuff has to stop. Knowing, as I'm sure many of you know, of Harry Truman's salty language, he didn't say stuff. On February 2nd, 1948, President Truman delivered the first ever message to Congress on civil rights. And that summer, he signed executive orders that desegregated the armed forces and the federal workforce. A friend from Kansas City wrote him a letter complaining about this. Harry, how can you know this? I know you from back in the old days. Truman wrote back to his friend, if this ends up in my failure to be reelected, that failure will be in a good cause. The year is 1950. Anna Rosenberg is finally back in New York. She's back with her husband. Her son, who'd served in World War II, is back. He's helping his mother put their business, their labor mediation business, back together. She finally bought that condo in New York City that she'd rented for decades. Life was good. But then she opened up her mail in October of 1950. She opened up a letter from the Secretary of Defense, General George C. Marshall. The letter began, Dear Anna, will you consider an appointment as Assistant Secretary of Defense? Wow. She knew she couldn't say no to the general. She venerated the man, but she also knew she had to be honest. She said not only to General Marshall, but to the president. Now, this is going to be, she said, I wear the bullseye. I am Jewish. I speak with an accent. I'm from Eastern Europe. It's the beginning of the Cold War. I'm a civilian woman. I'm pro-union. I'm a former New Dealer. They're going to come after me, General, and they're going to come after you. But to his credit and to the president's credit, General Marshall said, we will stick through this together. And they did. In November of 1950, Anna Rosenberg started her interim appointment after being unanimously approved by the Senate Armed Services Committee. She started her interim appointment as the Assistant Secretary of Defense under General George C. Marshall. The only thing that lay ahead was a full Senate vote, but that was considered just a formality. It's at this point that Senator Joe McCarthy steps onto the stage. McCarthy didn't want to see Anna Rosenberg in a top position at the Pentagon. He was not on the Senate Armed Services Committee, but he had friends in the Senate, and he used those connections and pulled some strings to buy a 2-week delay before the full Senate vote. In those 2 weeks, Senator McCarthy conjured up an ugly smear campaign that would try and portray Anna Rosenberg as disloyal to her country, a secret communist, someone who is a traitor to her country. The plan hinged on the testimony of one man. They found a man in New York named Ralph DeSola who would take the train down to Washington. They would have to reopen the Senate Armed Services Committee hearings, and he would testify that he'd seen Anna Rosenberg, that Anna Rosenberg, at a communist cell meeting back in the 1930s. Under withering questioning from Senator Lyndon Johnson, his story began to unravel immediately. Johnson wanted to know how, after 20 years, can you identify that woman there as the person that you saw in a crowded, smoky communist cell meeting in the Lower East Side? And of course he couldn't. He was lying and everybody knew it. When they called his ex-wife to testify, she said, Senators, off the record, my husband has a very tough time telling the truth. His employers were called. They said he has no capacity for veracity. Another employer said, I wouldn't believe a word this man said. His story went up in smoke almost as soon as he opened his mouth. And Anna Rosenberg, of course, always brought the receipts. She always did her homework. So she arrived at the hearings to face this man face to face with the New York City phone book. And she said, do you know how many Anna Rosenbergs are in this phone book? There are 47. So J. Edgar Hoover found the communist Anna Rosenberg. She was living out in California, but this Anna Rosenberg was a lifelong patriot, and she emerged with her career and her integrity intact. This elevation to the Assistant Secretary of Defense made her the top woman in the Truman administration, and you can see the letter on the right, President Truman saying, "I know these weeks have been hard for you, and I get that, and I understand it." But he was, as in so many other instances, both in terms of civil rights and in dealing with the McCarthyist wing, so courageous, a courage that I think a lot of Americans would hunger for a return to today. But you just, when I was at the library this morning, these two figures arrived at this moment in history, in World War II and the early Cold War, from such different paths. One was a farmer when he was a young man, and one was an immigrant to New York City. But to find themselves together at these pivotal moments in history was just something that I found just palpable and wonderful. And for both of them to have the courage of their convictions, to do what was right morally, even though they knew that there would be backlash from other elements. Anna Rosenberg made 2 trips to the Korean War, the battlefields of Korea, and again, just like World War II, she did not go as a VIP. This is her grandson's favorite picture of his grandmother. She's kneeling in the dirt with the guys. She would say, "Pipe down, fellas, give me the lowdown." She would lift up the pot on the soup lid to find out if the chow was any good. She would open up the footlocker to make sure that the socks were dry. She wanted to know from the soldiers themselves what they needed and what they wanted. You can see in this picture, these are integrated troops. And of course, Truman's executive order had been, the service branches had dragged their feet on that. So Anna made sure at the Pentagon that these service branches had fully integrated by the time of the Korean War. And what you have here is integrated troops here in the field. When she first arrived in Korea, a journalist said, "How many black Americans are serving in Korea? How many black troops are serving in Korea?" She said, "That's not the question. The question is how many American troops are serving in Korea." She also, when she got back to Washington, found out that in the southern bases, the schools were still stubbornly segregated. So that soldier's daughter would have to be bused off base to an inferior school. Well, there was no Department of Education then, it was the Office of Education. But she sorted that out in a hurry and made sure that, she said these are federal installations using taxpayer dollars, and this has to stop now, and it did. And what's remarkable, thinking back on it today, is that before Brown versus Board of Education, before the public schools of this country were desegregated, the military, both at home and abroad, military bases, schools were desegregated, thanks to the courage of President Truman, Anna Rosenberg. One of my favorite boxes of research was the letters from the soldiers themselves, both men and women, service members and their families. One unit men would send her Valentine's Day cards, soldiers would. One unit named her Miss Wolfhound of 1952, where she had to overcome Doris Day and Marilyn Monroe. One mother said, "Thank you for going to visit Tommy. It really encouraged him, and I'd like to send you a ham." Anna Rosenberg wrote back, "I love the sentiments. Please don't send me a ham." And boy, did I love opening this folder at Schlesinger Library in Harvard, where her papers are housed. I just love this letter from the first moment I read it. After she resigned at the end of her tenure at the Pentagon, this is the beginning of 1953 in the new administration, the Eisenhower administration, President Truman wrote her typed out a very lovely formal letter, thanking her for all the wonderful things that she'd done for the troops, reducing the points they needed to come home, increasing combat pay, increasing the size of the American Army, almost doubling it, more than doubling it. But he also wrote this very informal letter, which you can read up here, and I love it. We don't say this often enough anymore. You've done a whale of a job. There are no words adequately to express my appreciation. You can see here with Senator Johnson, you'll recognize him. They look like they're having a disagreement here. In this case, Johnson wants to keep the military budget in check, and Anna wants to do everything she can for the service members and their families. But they saw eye to eye on just about everything. They were tremendous friends for 35 years, from the New Deal up to World War II, the Cold War and beyond. Lyndon Johnson and Anna Rosenberg were tremendously fond of each other. I saw this today. This is interesting. This is a photograph from 1957 with kind regards to Anna Rosenberg and her daughter Jane, who's there from President Truman. Someone who knows more about these things can maybe tell me where they think that photograph, after the event tonight, where they think that photograph might have been taken. It looks to me like President Truman's at the piano, right? Her daughter-in-law, I believe her name was Jane Wade, was a native of Kansas City. The only president who did not use Anna Rosenberg to her capabilities was this one. John F. Kennedy primarily saw her as a fundraiser. She was, of course, a loyal American and did what she could for Kennedy, so she was the co-host of the 1962 birthday gala at Madison Square Garden. Yes. And that includes putting together the entertainment list, which included, Ella Fitzgerald and Danny Kaye and a dance troupe, and of course, Marilyn Monroe at the very, very end. When you next watch the video of this, look for the back of her head. She's standing and sitting and walking next to the president for the entire evening. Afterwards, Anna was the co-host of the after party at an apartment in New York City where President Kennedy was, his brother Robert Kennedy, Vice President Lyndon Johnson was there, and of course, the late Marilyn Monroe. Sadly, she would be found dead only 2 months after that photograph. Now, like I said, Anna did not have a college degree or advanced degrees, so you might think, what are those two things in her office at the Pentagon? Well, one of those is from a brewery union, a brewer's union. It said, Anna, you are tops. And over on the left, she's wearing her military uniform there, but the silk scarf is not military grade. In 1959, the legendary journalist Edward R. Murrow had Anna Rosenberg on his television program, Person to Person, and he asked her about what she would have faced. What was it like to be at the Pentagon as a woman, to have the French perfume and the heels up and down the corridors and the bangles that she wore, and to face the sexism. He didn't use that word, but he wanted to know what was it like to be a woman at the Pentagon, and she answered those questions. He also wanted to know what was it like to be at the top echelons of business and politics during this remarkable career, and she answered those questions. He asked her about her collection of fine china. He asked her about a collection of French perfume. And of course, he wanted to see some of those fancy hats that she always loved, and she showed him those hats. At the end, he asked her about those heroic days at the elbow of Roosevelt and at the elbow of Truman as the United States worked to be victorious in World War II and into the early Cold War. And he said, Anna, you have quite a book to write someday. And she said, Ed, that's a book that will never be written. But 40 years after her death, she died in 1983, it's tremendously gratifying that we're all here together to learn about this woman, this courageous woman, whose career was in the service of helping her country achieve victory in war and prosperity and peace. I hope we've saved time for some questions and answers, and I thank you all again for being here. I'm a high school history teacher, so I welcome the questions.
I'm asking this question on behalf of my wife.
Women rising.
We came out from St. Louis to visit the Truman Museum and to hear your talk tonight. And we had a great time at the Truman Library there and thought it was awesome. But we were kind of disappointed that there wasn't more about Anna at the museum, and I wondered what your thought, if you felt like she was underrepresented there.
Well, I think that she has, I think this is only the very beginning of her reemergence into the public consciousness. We think we know everything about the greatest generation and all the players, but turns out we don't. There's at least one more that we don't know about. And I do hope, not only at the Truman Museum, but at the Roosevelt Museum and maybe even at the Johnson Museum, I do hope that someday we'll be there and at least see a plaque or some recognition for what they did during those, what she did during those administrations. But I think we're at the very beginning of her reemergence as a figure in American history.
I have a question from the live stream. They ask, was Anna's husband and family with her during the years she served in Europe?
The answer is, for the most part, no. Her husband, Mike, her first husband, Mike, stayed in New York. It was a very uncommon relationship for the time. Her husband, Mike, had served in World War I, and I think had some invisible scars from that war that he never quite shook. That said, he seemed very disinterested in what she was doing, or not disinterested maybe, but he wasn't interested in being a public figure with her in Washington. That was her job, part of her career. So he stayed. He was a rug executive in New York. She split time. They didn't have the Acela back then, but whatever the train was, she split time between the Shoreham Hotel in Washington and her apartment in New York. But very uncommon. Her son, Thomas, went to Horace Mann for high school. Then he went to the University of Wisconsin. Then he served in World War II. And then when he came back, they worked together for her labor mediation and PR firm. She remarried in 1962 to a figure that has a big part in the Truman story as well. The man she married in 1962 was Paul Gray Hoffman, who was the first administrator of the Marshall Plan. And I love how he got that job. How he got that job is Harry Truman wanted him to have that job. President Truman wanted him to have that job and said to the press, well, Paul Gray Hoffman is going to be the first administrator of the Marshall Plan. So Gray Hoffman found out about his job from the press. And he accepted. He said it changed his life for the better. Yeah.
I'm kind of confused with McCarthy and the Rosenberg trials. Was there another set of Rosenbergs?
Terrific question. The question is about that surname Rosenberg, and that is part of why Anna Rosenberg has sort of disappeared from history. She was a famous person in her day. She was in the New York Times from 1917 until 1983 and every decade in between. She was in Time, in Life, in Saturday Evening Post, in magazines that are no longer here. She was in Vogue in 1942. She was in Vogue in 1942 with a dachshund on her lap. But she disappeared from history for reasons that include what that gentleman just mentioned. She had, unfortunately, the same name as the atomic spies that were arrested in 1950. So at the very moment she's reaching the apex of her career at the Pentagon, she has the same last name as the atomic spies that were on every newspaper. Moreover, she didn't have the college education like Frances Perkins, Columbia and Penn. She was a telephone person, not a pen person or a typing person. So she didn't leave the voluminous records that others would have left. She was a victim of her own success, using the telephone. And of course, she wanted to keep confident things confident.
I have another question from the live stream. James asks, can you tell us more about the labor negotiations she did?
She was going back to the early 1920s after her meeting with Belle Moskowitz. She was a pioneer in labor mediation. This is a time, when we go back to the 1920s, this was a time when you were pro-union or you were pro-management, but it was very uncommon to find common ground, and that was really her gift. Part of what she wanted to see from the companies that were paying her is more, we would call it more transparency. I don't know if that was a word that they used back then, but she wanted the employers to let their workers know exactly why they were doing what they were doing. What was the grander importance of their work? I'll give you an example from World War II. She was touring a defense factory, and there was a young woman, a war worker, Rosie the Riveter, was at this machine hammering out these little tiny screws. And the young woman's face was boredom. It was monotonous work. Anna linked her arm with her, said, let's go find out what these little tiny screws do. Walked her around the factory, found out, came back, and they were little tiny screws that were part of the bombardier sight for these sophisticated, expensive bombers. And she said the look on the woman's face completely changed. She was helping win the war. It wasn't just this monotonous job. She had a role that she was playing to help win the war. So that was a belief that Anna had in terms of her labor mediation. And, people like Nelson Rockefeller hired her, and they would say, she could have saved us tens of thousands of dollars if we'd only gone to her sooner. But yes, she also had the trust of the unions who would say stuff like, if Anna tells us something, we know she's on the level.
The fact that she was a confidant of the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, would certainly grease her way forward to Truman and Marshall and everything forward. But how in the world did an immigrant from Hungary end up becoming friendly with a patrician from moneyed wealth of old New York society? In the first place, could you say more about how that relationship developed in the first place?
It's a very interesting story. The question is, how does an immigrant to New York City become closely aligned and a confidant of a patrician like Roosevelt? And it goes back, to that first meeting with the Roosevelts in 1928. She found herself on the team. It was a sprint for that governor's race. She found herself on the team with Louis Howe and Francis Perkins and Jim Farley. And she must have shown her mettle at that time, because when it came time for the New Deal, Roosevelt wants her to be the only woman regional director of those massive programs, the second of which was Social Security. And this is remarkable because he needs that to work. If these programs of the New Deal don't work in his home state of New York, he's not going to be able to sell that to Iowa or Wyoming or Michigan. So he entrusted her, even as early as 1934-35, she had garnered the trust from Roosevelt to be able to tackle these large problems and tackle them successfully. So wearing a hat. But I just, and in my book, which I would all urge you to seek out, but in my book, it was 1941 where she really found herself in the innermost circle, because Missy Lehand was out and Tommy Corcoran was pushed out. And so the Roosevelt Roundtable had an extra seat, and that seat went to Anna Rosenberg for the duration of the war. Yes?
I was surprised at your take, or Anna's take, on Frances Perkins, because she is so revered in union circles. And was this just a personal rivalry, or is it actually your perspective that she was more figurehead and less effective than, maybe it's the relationship with the president?
Frances Perkins that's a wonderful question. Frances Perkins was the Secretary of Labor for the entirety of the Roosevelt presidency, and there's a lot in the research, a lot in the newspapers. They would call Anna Rosenberg during World War II Frances Perkins #2. They would call her the de facto Secretary of Labor, and it put the women in a very uncomfortable position, because this is a very Rooseveltian thing to do. I hope Truman didn't do this, but Roosevelt would put people on a parallel track, and he'd say, go score a touchdown for me, or go solve this problem. But they were working on along the same lines. And sometimes Anna got there before Frances Secretary Perkins, in part because Anna had a relationship with the folks on Capitol Hill that would have been the envy of someone like Secretary Perkins. She had a good relationship. She could walk up to Capitol Hill and talk to those guys one-on-one and get things done for Roosevelt and then later for Truman in a way that Perkins could not do. So Frances Perkins, it's certainly not my personal stake in that would only be to identify why the two women might have been so different. Frances Perkins was theater, tomato, and quite an education. And Anna Rosenberg was someone who was very different, younger, had greater access to the president, which bothered a lot of cabinet members. So the two women, Anna was always very respectful to Secretary Perkins, but Perkins, I think, allowed her resentment to get a little bit the better of her at points.
I have a final question from the live stream, who asked, what was Anna's relationship like with Dwight Eisenhower? She seemed to be close to the Democrats. How about Ike? I'm
glad that question came up. The first political speech that Dwight Eisenhower, first of all, she knew him as general. They had met during the war, and like Patton, Eisenhower was very fond of her. His first political speech that he ever wrote was in 1946, and it was Anna Rosenberg helped him put that together. It was for the AFL-CIO. She helped, and her second husband, Paul Hoffman, helped steer Eisenhower from soldier to statesman. And they had a stake in it. They thought if there was going to be a general that was going to be the next president, a World War II hero, it should be Eisenhower instead of MacArthur. So they worked to convince, in fact, her second husband, Hoffman, flew over to Europe when Ike was back at European headquarters and persuaded him, said about his grandson, would you like your grandson David to grow up in a world where the United States doesn't have the security? And it convinced, he was part of the people, and she was part of the people that convinced Eisenhower to run in 1952. So she was a tremendous supporter of Eisenhower. And Paul Hoffman was a lifelong Republican, and she was married to him from 1962 until he died in the mid-1970s. So she's more known as maybe on the Democratic side, but she was an American first and foremost.
Do a last call for questions, so if you've been thinking about asking one, come on up.
Anna seems just like a really impressive woman, but I was just curious, what did she see as her legacy? Like, what was her proudest accomplishment? Well,
She wanted women to, even in World War II, the way she saw it, this wasn't just white women, this white women, African-American women, she wanted women during World War II to take a greater role in the fighting of the war. She, like the president, thought it was a global war, it was an all-hands-on-deck war, it was an all-out, it wasn't just the men fighting, in the trenches against each other, it was a societal war that required sacrifices from everybody. From the women, from the children, from everybody. And what she thought, though, is that with those sacrifices in World War II, that would then lead to greater social equality for women after the war. She had the same thought during the Korean War. And more women were put in positions in the Korean War that weren't just typewriter soldiers. They were in communications, they were in other important roles. She was disappointed after both wars when women did not get their due. We think about the ticker tape parade. The women didn't get that. The wax and the waves, that was not the response that they got when they came home. And Anna was bitterly disappointed about this. And the same with Korea. She wanted these women to make careers out of the military, good careers they'd be proud of. But there was such a stigma in the 1950s about women doing these types of jobs that it was not to be. So she, at the end of her life, I regret to say, she was rather disappointed that more women hadn't taken greater roles in American society. But I think today, we think about so many powerful women governors, women in Congress, women on the Supreme Court. I think today she would be satisfied that at long last, what she wanted, what she dreamed of, has finally come to pass. Not yet. All right, more. I agree. More women.
I think that is a great question to end on. On behalf of the Institute, Christopher, thank you so much for sharing Anna's wonderful story with us tonight.